The dense Alaskan wilderness was not just a forest. It was a living, breathing entity that seemed to watch every step we took. My friend Alex and I had decided to set up our small nylon tent at the very edge of the tree line, far away from the safety of the main campsite. The air was unnervingly still, and the usual sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves and distant owls, had completely vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. We sat in the dark, the thin fabric of the tent offering a pathetic illusion of protection against the vast unknown outside. Suddenly, a sound began to drift through the trees, a low and rhythmic drone that didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard. It was a deep, vibrating hum, reminiscent of a dozen voices harmonizing on a single hollow note. It felt human, yet entirely alien, moving steadily closer toward our position with predatory intent. Alex grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin as the noise grew louder. The sound didn't waver. It was a constant, terrifying drone that seemed to be suspended in the air at head height. We watched the walls of the tent, expecting to see a shadow cast by the bright moonlight, but there was absolutely nothing there. The entity was invisible, a ghost of sound circling our small shelter, marking us as its chosen prey for the long night. The humming circled us once, twice, then slowly moved toward the other tents near the shore. We held our breath, hearing it fade into the distance, but the fear remained lodged in our chests like a cold stone. I realized then that the forest wasn't empty. It was filled with things that defied explanation. We lay there for hours, staring into the darkness, knowing that whatever had circled our tent was still out there, waiting in the deep shadows. By dawn, the forest had returned to normal, but the memory of that sound stayed with us. We searched the damp ground around our tent for tracks, hoping to find evidence of a prank or a wild animal, but the earth was undisturbed. There were no footprints, no broken twigs, nothing to prove that something had been standing just inches away from our heads. It was as if the entity had never touched the ground, floating through the trees like a silent mist. As the days passed, I began to notice a change in the atmosphere of our group. People were becoming irritable, glancing over their shoulders at the tree line as if they could feel eyes upon them. The girl I liked, Lisa, mentioned hearing a whispering voice outside her tent that sounded exactly like her own mother's. The isolation of the Alaskan bay was starting to crack our sanity, turning our dream trip into a waking nightmare that we couldn't escape from. One evening, while collecting firewood, I found a series of ancient, rotted ship parts, half buried in the dirt. A massive wooden helm stood upright, its deck attachment covered in thick moss and decay. It looked like a grave marker for a crew that had been lost a century ago. As I touched the cold, wet wood, the humming sound returned for a brief second, vibrating through my fingertips. I dropped the wood and ran back to the light of the campfire, trembling. That night, the humming was louder and more aggressive. It didn't just circle. It pressed against the fabric of the tent, the sound so intense that it made my teeth ache. Alex was whispering prayers under his breath, his eyes wide with a terror that I had never seen in a popular athlete. We were no longer in control of our surroundings. We were merely guests in a place that didn't want us, subjected to the whims of a force that thrived on our growing fear. I looked at the tent door, tempted to unzip it just an inch to see what was there, but my survival instinct screamed at me to stay hidden. The moon was so bright that every silhouette of the trees was sharp and clear, yet the space where the sound originated remained empty. It was a vacuum of light, a hole in reality that was singing a death song to us. The drone moved on to the chaperone's tent, and I heard a muffled cry of confusion from within. The next morning, one of the chaperones refused to leave his tent. He claimed that something had been whispering his darkest secrets to him all night, its voice a perfect mimic of his late wife. The psychological toll was becoming visible on everyone's faces. We were 10 kids and 4 adults, but we felt utterly alone against a hillside of evergreen forest that seemed to stretch on for an eternity, hiding 1,000 more horrors within its dark, tangled depths. We decided to move the camp closer to the water, thinking the sound of the waves might drown out the humming. But the ocean offered no sanctuary. At low tide, I walked to the small island nearby and found a circle of stones that looked like an altar. Inside the circle lay a black garbage bag, similar to the one the police found back in my hometown years ago. My heart hammered as I approached it, the smell of salt and decay filling my nostrils instantly. I didn't open the bag. I couldn't. The trauma of my past was merging with the horror of the present. I remembered the man the police caught in the woods with a knife, his breathing heavy and uneven as he chased me. I realized that whether in the suburbs or the Alaskan wilderness, there is always a predator. The humming started again, this time coming from the island's center. I scrambled back to the main shore, the freezing water soaking my boots. Alex met me at the shore, his face pale. He said he had seen a figure standing on the hillside, a man clutching a long, sharp instrument that caught the light. We were being watched not just by a sound, but by something solid and dangerous. We told the chaperones, but they were too focused on the man who had lost his mind to listen. They told us to stay within sight of the fire, but even the flames felt small and weak against the coming dark. The final night arrived with a violent storm that ripped through the bay. The wind howled, mirroring the humming sound that had plagued us. Our tent was nearly blown away, the thin stakes pulling out of the sandy soil. Through the flashes of lightning, I saw the figure again. He was standing right outside the girls' tent, holding a saw that gleamed with a sickening wetness. I tried to scream, but the wind swallowed my voice, leaving me helpless. I managed to crawl out of the tent, fighting the rain and the mud. I reached the girls' tent just as a shadow moved away into the woods. Lisa was safe, but she was pointing at the sand. There, in the middle of the storm, were the only footprints we had seen all trip. They weren't human. They were elongated and deep, as if something incredibly heavy had been standing there for hours. The predator wasn't just a man. It was something far more ancient. The seaplane finally arrived the next day to take us back to civilization. We piled into the small cabin in silence, none of us looking back at the beautiful bay that had nearly destroyed us. As we took off, I looked down at the forest and saw a single silver-painted figure standing on the beach, waving slowly. It was a mockery of a human gesture. I knew then that the horror wouldn't stay on the island. It had already taken root in our minds. Years later, I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that humming sound in the quiet of my bedroom. I think about the man the police found and the thing on the beach, and I wonder if they were the same. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural is thinner than we think. I never went camping again, preferring the safety of bright city lights, but even here, the silence of the night sometimes feels a little too heavy to be natural. My neighbor in the city died recently, and the surreal speed of the event reminded me of the island. I watched the EMTs swarm the building, their blue lights flashing against the brick walls. I saw his roommate sitting in the common room, listening to classical music with a blank, traumatized look. It made me realize that even in a crowded building, you can be inches away from a horror that no one else can see until it is far too late to help. I heard that the roommate had been sitting there for 20 minutes while the man died, just watching him. It brought back the feeling of the humming sound, the passive, cold observation of a predator watching its prey. I started locking my doors with extra deadbolts, afraid that the stillness of my apartment was just another trap. I could almost hear the low drone starting in the hallway, a sound that only I was tuned to hear after Alaska. One night I woke up to find my own voice talking in my sleep. My boyfriend was nudging me, looking panicked, telling me I was having a full conversation with something in the corner of the room. The corner was the darkest place in the apartment, a void of shadows. I had no memory of it, but I felt a familiar heat on the back of my neck. Something had followed me back from the woods, a stowaway in my soul that was finally making its presence known. I began to experience sleep paralysis, seeing figures standing in the doorway every time the room went quiet. They didn't move or speak. They just stood there, suspended at that humanish height I remembered from the tent. My past encounters were coalescing into a single terrifying reality. I was no longer a survivor. I was a marked person, a vessel for the echo of the hollow. Every silence was now a threat, every shadow a potential hiding spot. I decided to move out, hoping a change of scenery would break the cycle. I packed my car and drove down a back road late at night, letting the autopilot take control while I tried to calm my racing heart. The road was empty, lined with thick trees that reminded me too much of the hillside in Petersburg. The music in the car was loud, but I could still feel the weight in my stomach, the sick feeling that the forest was never truly behind me. Out of nowhere, the car braked violently, the alarming sound of the collision, warning, filling the cabin. I grabbed the wheel, my heart pounding against my ribs. Inches from my bumper stood a figure, unmoving and silent. It was a woman, naked and covered in lacerations, her eyes glazed and staring straight through the windshield. She looked exactly like the person I had found in the woods when I was 15, a ghost from a rabbit hole I never escaped. I put the car in park and used a megaphone to ask if she was okay, but she didn't respond. She just walked slowly toward my window, her movements jerky and unnatural. I locked the doors, my fingers trembling so much I nearly dropped the key. She asked me to roll down the window, her voice sounding like the humming drone from the island. She said her name was Ashton, but I knew she wasn't human. She was the forest taking a form I recognized. She insisted that I drop her off at a friend's house nearby, but there were no houses for miles, only the endless evergreen trees. She reached for the door handle, her fingers scratching against the metal as she realized they were embedded. I didn't wait for another word. I floored the pedal, the Tesla screaming as it flew down the road. I didn't look in the rearview mirror, terrified that I would see her running behind me with the speed of a bullet. I reached the main road and didn't stop until I was under the bright lights of a gas station. I was shaking, my adrenaline coursing through me like a drug. I realized that the man in the woods, the humming in the tent, and the woman on the road were all connected. They were manifestations of a singular malicious force that hunts in the quiet places. I prayed that I was finally safe, but deep down, I knew the chase would never truly end. The next morning, I checked the car's Sentry Mode footage. The camera showed the woman standing by the window, but as she reached for the handle, her form shifted and blurred, turning back into a cloud of shimmering mist. The police found nothing on the road, no signs of an accident or a stranded person. I was left with only my memories and a growing sense of dread that the world is much darker than we are ever taught to believe. I settled into a new apartment, but the sleep-talking continued. My boyfriend left me, unable to handle the nightly conversations I had with the shadows. I was alone again, just as I had been in that hollow in the woods. I started to record myself at night, hoping to hear what I was saying. When I played the tapes back, I didn't hear my voice. I heard the humming, the perfect, breathless drone of the monks from the Alaskan Bay. The recordings were hours long, the sound never wavering in pitch or intensity. It was as if I had become a human radio for the entity, I looked at the dark corners of my room and realized that the shadows were moving, inching closer to my bed every night. The silence of the city was no different from the silence of the forest. It was a blank canvas for the echo to draw its horrors upon. I stopped fighting and just waited for the end. On the final tape, there was a new sound. After the humming stopped, a hoarse, deep panting began, followed by the clinking of metal instruments. A voice, sounding like a distorted version of my neighbor who died, whispered, "It's been 20 minutes, Lydia. Time to wake up." I opened my eyes to see the silver-painted man standing over me, a saw in his hand. I didn't scream. I had finally reached the bottom of the rabbit hole. Living in a high-rise apartment complex should have felt safe, but the building had a somber energy that I couldn't ignore. My neighbor, a sassy old man who preferred dogs over my cat, had passed away suddenly while I was out getting a newspaper. When I returned, the lobby was swarming with police and EMTs, their presence a jarring intrusion into our quiet lives. I felt a strange guilt, as if my 30-minute absence had allowed death to slip inside. The man's roommate was a quiet individual who always had his earbuds in, seemingly lost in a world of classical music. After the death, he sat in the common room with a blank, hollow look on his face that everyone assumed was trauma. But as I watched him, I noticed that his fingers were moving rhythmically, as if he were conducting an invisible orchestra. There was a coldness in his eyes that didn't match the grief of losing a long-time companion. One of our jerk neighbors tried to joke that the roommate had killed the old man, but we all hushed him, feeling it was too cruel. We agreed that losing a roommate in such a sudden way was horrific. However, as the weeks went by, the roommate became even more bizarre. He would walk past us in the hall without a word, his headphones always on, his gaze fixed on something we couldn't see. He felt like a ghost inhabiting a living body. I eventually heard the building staff whispering about the day they found the body. The old man was lying sideways across the bed in nothing but a diaper, his head almost touching the floor in a grotesque position. The roommate had been sitting just 10 feet away, calmly watching him die for over 20 minutes without calling for help. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just neglect. It was a deliberate, silent observation. I started noticing strange things in my own apartment after that. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of classical music drifting through the vents, but it was distorted, slowed down until it sounded like a funeral dirge. My boyfriend began to complain that I was sitting up in my sleep and talking to the corner of the room. He said I looked like I was having a full conversation with someone who wasn't there, my eyes wide and glazed. The fear began to affect my daily life. I had never spoken in my sleep before, and the sudden onset of this behavior, combined with the death next door, felt like an insidious infection. I experienced my first bout of sleep paralysis, seeing a figure in a navy polo shirt standing in my doorway. He didn't have a face, just a smooth, silver surface where his features should have been. He felt like a placeholder for something much more dangerous. I decided I needed to get away, so I took a long drive on the back roads one Friday night. I put my Tesla on autopilot and tried to relax with some music, but I was too distracted by my phone, scrolling through articles about local deaths and unexplained phenomena. Out of nowhere, the car's emergency brakes slammed on, throwing me forward against the seatbelt. An alarming sound echoed in the cabin, signaling a near miss with a pedestrian. Standing just inches from my hood was a man who looked to be in his late 20s. He didn't flinch or move, even though he had almost been killed. I stared at him through the windshield for 10 seconds, my heart racing. He looked exhausted, his clothes torn and stained with what looked like dry blood. I turned on the car's megaphone to ask if he was okay, but he just stared at me with eyes that were glassy and glazed, just like the old man's. He walked toward my window and asked me to roll it down. I refused, locking the doors and telling him I could hear him through the glass. He said his name was Ashton and that his car had broken down nearby. He seemed normal at first, but then he started insisting that I drop him off at a friend's house. He didn't want me to call for help. He wanted me to let him into the car. The suspicion in my gut turned into full-blown terror. He reached for the handle, his fingers fumbling with the embedded design of the Tesla. I saw a movement in the trees behind him, other figures, pale and naked, shifting in the shadows. He wasn't alone. I floored the pedal and didn't stop until I reached the city limits. The whole ride back, I felt like someone was breathing down the back of my neck. I realized that the ritual my neighbor's roommate had been performing was far from over. When I got home, I found my front door slightly ajar. My boyfriend was gone, and on the kitchen table sat a black garbage bag filled with sharp instruments and a blood-smeared saw. I realized with horror that the roommate wasn't just a witness. He was a recruiter. The monks I had heard about in Alaska, the man in the woods, and the roommate were all part of a network of predators who used silence and sound to break their victims. I checked the common room, and there he was, the roommate, still sitting in his usual chair at 11 p.m. He looked at me and smiled for the first time, a sassy old man smile that didn't belong on his young face. He took out his earbuds, and the sound of the humming drone filled the room, vibrating through the walls. "Your boyfriend is ready for his 20 minutes, Lydia," he whispered, his voice a perfect mimic of my own. I ran back to my apartment and locked the door, but I could hear the classical music starting again, louder than ever. It wasn't coming from the vents anymore. It was coming from inside my own head. I realized that the monks weren't outside. They were the collective voices of everyone who had died in this building. The old man, my neighbor, was now part of the drone, his sassiness replaced by the hollow, endless harmony of the word Om. I began to see the lacerations on my own arms, wounds I didn't remember getting. I was becoming the woman in the woods, the fetal position victim I had once pitied. The roommate tapped on the wall from the other side, a rhythmic, clinking noise that sounded like metal on bone. He was conducting my descent into madness. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen only showed a video of me talking to the corner of the room. In the video, I wasn't alone. A figure was standing in the darkness of the corner, its hands resting on my shoulders. It was the old man, his face a mask of dry blood and silver paint. He was whispering into my ear, and my sleeping self was nodding in agreement. I realized that I had invited the predator weeks ago when I first felt that survival instinct heat on the back of my neck. The invitation was permanent, signed in the silence of death. I decided to fight back. I grabbed the saw from the garbage bag, its weight clunky and awkward in my hand. I would not be the next hider caught in the undergrowth. I waited by the door for the roommate to come for me. I could hear his uneven, panting breath in the hallway, the sound of a man who was exhausted but eager. The cat-and-mouse game had reached its final stage, and this time the cat had a blade of its own to use. The door handle turned slowly. I braced myself, my legs wobbly like jello, but my heart racing with Usain Bolt adrenaline. As the door creaked open, I saw not the roommate, but my boyfriend. He was naked and covered in wounds, his eyes glassy and glazed. He didn't recognize me. He was just a vessel now, a puppet moved by the conductors in the hall. I dropped the saw, the clinking noise echoing in the somber, insidious silence of the apartment. Behind him, the roommate stood, still conducting with his earbuds in. He pointed at me, and my boyfriend began to move forward, his movements jerky. I realized that the only way to escape was to become the predator myself. I picked up the saw again and stepped into the hallway, screaming bloody murder to wake up the entire camp, or in this case, the entire building. But no doors opened. The residents were all listening to their own classical music. I ran for the stairs, the roommates' laughter echoing behind me. I didn't trip, despite the adrenaline and the fear. I reached the lobby and burst out into the night, but the city was gone. In its place was the evergreen forest of Alaska, the bay glowing under a dream-like blue moon. I was back where it all began, the circle finally complete. The humming was deafening now, a wall of sound that blocked every exit and every possible hope. I found the hollow in the undergrowth and crawled inside, my hands and knees scraping against the dirt. I saw myself at 15, staring back at me with glazed eyes. I was the younger woman I had found all those years ago. The timeline was a loop, a rabbit hole with no bottom. I sat in the fetal position and waited for the man with the knife to find me. I could hear his heavy boots dragging something clunky through the brush toward my hiding spot. But the man didn't have a knife. He had a pair of earbuds. He sat down 10 feet away and looked at his watch. 20 minutes, Lydia, he said softly. I realized then that the horror wasn't the violence, but the wait. The anticipation of the end was the real ritual. I closed my eyes and joined the harmony, my voice finally finding the correct note of the drone. The monks were right. There is a peace in the hollow if you stop fighting. The next morning, building staff found 2 bodies in my apartment. They said it looked like a mutual tragedy, but they couldn't explain the silver paint on the walls or the smell of her tud that hung in the air. The roommate was gone, leaving only his classical music CDs behind. The jerk neighbor stopped making jokes, his face becoming as somber and insidious as the rest of the residents. The building was finally silent, the ritual successfully completed. But sometimes people driving on the back roads late at night see a figure in a Tesla. The car is on autopilot, and the driver is sitting up in their sleep, talking to the corner of the cabin. They look like they are having a full conversation with the air. If you look closely, you might see a shimmering mist circling the car, a humanish height off the ground, humming a song that has no pauses for breath and no end in sight. The police still find black garbage bags in the woods, filled with sharp instruments and saws. They call it the work of a serial killer, but they can't find a single footprint or a drop of blood that matches a known victim. It's as if the people simply vanish into the sound, becoming part of the forest hillside. The evergreen trees keep their secrets well, burying the rotted planks and pulleys of our lives under a layer of damp, mossy dirt. I still nightmares of the man chasing me, but in my dreams, I am also the one doing the chasing. I am the predator and the prey, the conducting roommate and the sassy old man. The trauma is a plethora of sharp instruments, each one carving a new piece of the script. I realized that I never really left that campground when I was 15. I'm still out there in the middle of nowhere, playing a game of manhunt that will last forever. I exchanged looks of solidarity with the shadows in my room. We know the truth. The world is just a glorified flash tag game, and the hunters always win eventually. The last man standing doesn't get a candy bar. They get to join the choir. I sit at my table and conduct the silence, my earbuds playing a drone that only I can hear. It's a wondrous, beautiful miracle how easy it is to forget the world when you're in the hollow. My cat stares at the corner of the room, her back arched and her fur standing on end. She sees the roommate standing there, his navy polo shirt stained with burgundy stains. She hears the humming that I have become. I tell her it's okay, that he prefers dogs anyway. The sassiness of my old neighbor lives on in me, a small spark of personality in a vast, cold vacuum of sound and silver paint. I look out my window at the city lights and see the shimmering beads of mercury on the ledge. The alchemist has been here too. The toxic metal is a physical marker of the insidious change. We are all being transmutation into something glazed and glassy, something that can look straight through a person without seeing them at all. We are the new monks, the harmonizers of the modern indie horror aesthetic, flat and thick-lined. The air horn sounds in the distance, announcing that the head start is over. I hear the cracks and crashes of the hunters moving through the trails toward my building. They are coming to identify me, to make me join their forces. I don't run this time. I stay in my catatonic position, like a marble carving, waiting for the clinking noises to reach my door. I am the winning spot, the surefire method of escape that worked after all. The roommate enters, unzips his navy polo, and reveals the void within. He hands me a pair of earbuds. "Did you hear that too?" he asks, his voice a perfect reflection of the Alaskan Bay. I nod, put them in, and finally go back to sleep. The forest noises return, the humpback whales sing in the bay, and the world goes dead silent once again. The script is finished, and the ventilation of my soul is finally complete.